Hello, friends, and welcome back to a brand new season of Building at the Edges, a podcast from C Club. I am your host, Jess, or that tall guy on the internet. At C Club, we think there's near infinite opportunity to lean into the weird and optimistic spaces at the intersection of blockchains, tokens, culture, and community. And this podcast is our opportunity to talk to the people who are actively building at that intersection. Today, I am very excited to bring you a conversation with Lee Jin and Jesse Walden of Variant. Lee and Jesse are two people who've been very active at defining a quote-unquote economy. Jesse helped define the ownership economy and has been a very prolific writer on that topic, something we'll get into today. And Lee helped define something called the passion economy, I think a different angle on what many of us would refer to as the creator economy today. In this podcast, we talk about the value of turning users into owners. We talk about the ownership economy as a pathway to the passion economy. We break down some of the narratives surrounding decentralization and distributed ownership to analyze what truly is driving value in the ownership economy. We discuss what kind of ownership experiences people actually want. Do people really want to be owners? I think it's some interesting nuance there. We talk about tokens as products and token design as consumer experience. And we talk about a recent announcement from the Variant team about the Variant Founder Fellowship. It's a privilege to have both of these folks on, and I'm very excited to be able to bring you this podcast today. So let's get into it. Lee, Jesse, welcome to the pod.
Thanks so much for having us. It's great to be back.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I think you're repeat guests, which I love. Excited to have both of you on at this time. I think as we're thinking about the topics to get into here, of course, there's just like dozens of things we can get into. But I think to me, like the unique thing is both of you have sort of had these moments of being core to popularizing an economy, the creator economy, the ownership economy. It's almost like a trope now that we're trying to call everything an economy in some way, but I will say that you were there before it started to become a bit of a trope. And so for me, the fascination is really trying to understand what are your sort of updated takes on these things. And especially since you have come together and sort of combined efforts to build Variant and back teams and builders who are sort of building the new internet, building this ownership economy. I thought this would be such a great opportunity for us to kind of dive into your thoughts there, how they've evolved. And I know just on our previous talk, there's just going to be a dozen little sort of tangents we can go on that I think people will find super interesting. So, I think to me, and I think to many of our listeners, one of the core reasons why we are building in Web3 is this idea that I think it was popularized in the ownership economy, that the apps, the networks, the platforms that we are investing our heartbeats into creating value on could actually be owned by us as individuals rather than by just investors. And so I'm curious if we're sort of a few years into this idea of the ownership economy, we have billions of dollars invested in this space. I'm curious how you think that has played out so far.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, so I think it was in December of 2019 that I published this post called The Passion Economy and the Future of Work. It feels like eons ago. And it was this post that basically described how technology could be used to enable people to monetize their passions, to do what they love doing for a living, to be able to do work that didn't feel like work necessarily. And it was really an extension of all of the writing and analysis that I had been doing on marketplaces over the years. I was at A16Z covering consumer tech, which included marketplaces, social, all sorts of different consumer platforms. And I had this realization that these marketplaces were getting more niche, they were evolving, they were becoming more managed, they were supporting more and more complex types of transactions. And where that led to was the enablement of many more people to be able to monetize their skills or expertise in different ways. So I called this the passion economy. I predicted that a wide range of these different platforms could enable people all over the world to be able to monetize their unique expertise. I think the phrase that I used was monetizing individuality. So these weren't marketplaces that commodified people like the gig platforms did, but that really accentuated their individuality. And I think this was uniquely enabled by the internet and by these platforms because previously in human history, if you had some specialized skill or expertise, you weren't necessarily able to make a living off of that because there might be only, 5 people in your city who valued that thing that you could be able to charge. But with the internet, with these global networks, people could all of a sudden make a living off of very niche skill sets. And so I began to invest against this thesis. I started a fund against this thesis called Atelier Ventures in early 2020. COVID was also a huge catalyst to this trend where lots of people had these moments where they took a step back from their jobs or their employment situations and thought about what they actually wanted to do with their time. And as I continued to invest against the thesis of the passion economy, there was always this tension that became quite apparent to me, which was this tension between the users of these platforms who are deriving income from them versus who they were actually owned by, people who were actually capturing most of the value from the success of these platforms. And I wanted to reconcile that tension in some way. So in my mind, the way to reconcile that tension back then was, let's just make these users investors of the platforms. Let's make them owners, because if that is where the value is getting captured, we should just make these users owners. And then, I mean, I'm fast forwarding through the idea maze, but I encountered lots of issues with that approach. A lot of these people weren't accredited investors. There were caps on Reg CF and how startups could crowdfund from non-accredited investors, et cetera. And then it dawned on me that everything that Jesse had been writing over the years and talking about over the years could be applied to address this issue, to make people owners at scale. I always like to joke that Jesse is 5 or 10 years ahead of me, or ahead of everyone else in his thinking. So far ahead that sometimes I don't understand what he's saying in the moment. But then years later, I'm like, oh, this is what he was talking about. I remember when I first published The Passion Economy and the Future of Work in 2019, he had said oh, this is actually very related to crypto. You're actually a crypto investor. You just don't know it yet. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I didn't really see the connection. But over time, I saw the connection very powerfully. And that is why I'm now here as a crypto investor, because the thesis is powerfully enabled through crypto. The vision that we have of crypto is one in which products and services make their users at scale. And we build an internet that actually rewards people meritocratically for their contributions through tokens. I think the summation of it all is the passion economy is still the North Star goal. It's the what, and how we get there is through the ownership economy.
Yeah, as Lee mentioned, so I was also at Andreessen prior to starting Variant, and we had to launch the first crypto fund there. And yeah, the insight that I had at the time when we, didn't understand what I was talking about, because I barely knew what I was talking about, was that the thing that was kind of new and exciting about the early crypto networks, Bitcoin and Ethereum, was that they did not originate in Silicon Valley. They were built sort of by independent, contributors all over the world who were contributing open source code, running it on their machines. And the powerful thing was that these contributors had a really strong incentive to do that, which was that, by running the code on their machines, they were earning tokens in the network, right? And those tokens represent ownership of the network itself. And I was like, this is something that Silicon Valley understands really well. Give the most talented people in the world an incentive to work on your project in the form of employee stock options, give them ownership. But these were networks that were doing it sort of at internet scale, not in Silicon Valley, right? Anyone with an internet connection could participate. I was like, okay, developers and technologists all over the world were early to understand this. They get it and they're doing it. And, pretty soon everyone else is going to be doing the same thing. So that was sort of the insight that I had and how I made the connection to Lee's passion economy post. So fast forward to today, right? I think 2020 was a really sort of important inflection point for the space, because that's when we start to see a lot of projects at the application layer of the stack, as opposed to sort of the lower level infrastructure, progressively decentralize and make their users owners, right? So Compound was famously kind of first to do this in DeFi. They were the first DeFi application to launch a token and distribute it to users. Anyone who was around watching that will know that quickly became known as yield farming or liquidity mining, which was generally sort of associated with these tokens being immediately dumped and treated as short-term sort of yield. And that's all to say that I think those sort of instantiations of distributing ownership through the form of tokens were sort of very sort of crude implementations where, they did not achieve the ends of building sustainable networks where users are owners. Rather, users were earning tokens and sort of quickly dumping them. So today, I think we've started to see change on the margins towards more sophisticated, more thoughtful distributions of ownership. that more strategically target the behaviors that you kind of want to reward in these networks. And I think that's sort of the long journey that we're on, is figuring out how to better optimize that to actually realize the core of our thesis, which is you can build networks that grow bigger, faster by actually making users owners and making the success of the product or service align with their success. We're pretty early still. That's the TLDR, and we can sort of unpack that.
I think it's interesting because I always think of crypto as being such a novel thing in that it's come out both in the era of the internet, right? So we have perfect connectivity, and it also can be speculated on from day one. And most other technological innovations, like the long sort of nose of the innovation, has actually takes a much longer time to get to a point where people actually see it and touch it and can speculate on it. And so I think it leads to this belief that we should be a lot further along than we are right now. And so I think it's very easy, I think, for probably most folks listening to this podcast to go, yeah, I get the ownership economy. That is a world that I see that I want to live in. And then the natural question is like, okay, well, why aren't more products or applications actually user owned today?
Right. I think there's a number of reasons. One is, so I think it's really difficult to build a great product by committee, right? Like great products are sort of lightning in a bottle, and you can't just like will lightning to exist by chanting and holding hands. Like somebody has to have the vision and like create it. And so that's a prerequisite for anything in this space to be successful. You first have to build a product that people want. And then over time, I think you can start to distribute ownership out to users based on their contributions to it. I think one of the major things holding back progress on this front is there's this obsession with decentralization that oftentimes is kind of counterproductive towards building a product that people want, scaling it up, etc. And there's kind of two reasons I think people are maybe a little overly obsessed with decentralization. One is the origins of the space. So, Bitcoin, Ethereum, networks like that benefit from, they need to be decentralized because that's their whole value proposition. Like digital gold that's sovereign needs to be decentralized at the core. A global computer like Ethereum, it needs to be decentralized to offer the security guarantees that make it sort of a good place to build stuff. But it doesn't follow that all of the applications that get built on top of these things actually benefit from decentralization to the same degree. And that's because these applications are often more complex. Like if you take like an NFT marketplace as an example, marketplaces are very dynamic. Like they need different things at different times to load balance the marketplace. And it's very hard to do that by committee, right? So I think an important distinction that's often overlooked in the space is the value of decentralizing control and decision-making from user ownership. And I think there's analogs to look at here that are useful. In the traditional economy, there's organizations that are owned by their users, like credit unions, cooperatives, mutuals, and all of them that have scaled, they have adopted a management structure that resembles that of a corporation, which means like there's a board, there's CEO, people who make decisions. But those people are accountable to the owners who are the actual users of those products and services. And I think that balance is really healthy. It enables these organizations to scale up. We need more of that in crypto. Again, there's this obsession with decentralization because that's the base layer, but it doesn't follow from that all the applications should follow the same model. The other reason that people are obsessed with decentralization is compliance. In 2018, the SEC said Ethereum is sufficiently decentralized, therefore it is not a security. And since then, basically everybody has been focused on becoming sufficiently decentralized, even though that's a term that has never been defined by the SEC or anyone else. It's very nebulous. And today the SEC probably doesn't even believe it really exists. And so there's been this pursuit of sufficient decentralization for compliance purposes, even though in practical terms, it may not be the best thing for the space. And bringing this all back to, the distribution of tokens, the result has been like people are just flinging tokens out there, as widely as possible, as quickly as possible, without giving much thought to how it actually is going to result in the behaviors that you want to see from users that make the network grow bigger, faster, and sustainably over time.
So, okay, when I hear that answer, I hear there's sort of like an overhang that we're working through around what will eventually seem like an outdated model of thinking here as far as how ownership gets distributed, and that likely tokens are going to start playing a role much later in the product life cycle than they are today. And sort of like the pure distribution or like a project launching with a token launch that, if we even just think back 2 years, that DeFi summer, like there was just a ton of action around that. And we've seen that slow down significantly over the last little while. But so we'll see more teams go deep and have tokens, once we like to say, build something people actually want to be a part of. That's when the idea of governing decision-making or distributing tokens can start to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, and I might diff it just a little bit to say, I think there are products for which it does make sense to sort of employ user ownership earlier on. It's just the way that you do that may need to be more constrained or sort of narrowly defined, again, to reward specific behaviors at specific times to scale up the product in the way that makes sense. I can give one quick example as well, which is I think Blur recently did a good job of this, where they sort of dripped out different incentives over time, incentives that were, very specifically targeted to what they felt the marketplace needed at a given time. And again, that's hard to do in a fully decentralized context where every decision to drip out more tokens needs to be made by committee. It's a lot easier to do when you have someone with a vision, and expertise on how to balance the marketplace. So that's what I mean. It can happen fairly early, just needs to happen in a more targeted way than it's been happening in the past.
Fair. Yeah, I think Blur is such a wonderful example because there's two things that are very subtle I think are really important there. One, the promise of building a user-owned network carries a lot of weight, and that intentionality and narrative can actually, I think, take us pretty far. Obviously, people are thinking, if I go participate here, there's an airdrop for me in the future, aka ownership. I think the other piece that did really well was the variable rewards. Like it's, I think, very hard to say, especially when we look at the overall promise of like, say, the value of one's data. Exchanging all my data to Facebook for the $15 that I'm worth to them every year is just not compelling to me in any way. But Blur kind of built a bit of a game. There's a variable reward mechanism that was brought in there that I think was actually pretty interesting as well. I think there's also this sort of idea, or maybe an outstanding question that I always have is like, do people actually want ownership? Because with ownership comes responsibilities, or at least different levels of responsibilities. I sort of ask this question rhetorically a little bit because I don't I have a strong opinion of it, but I think it's an important one to ask because most people, I think, want ownership experiences. They don't want those ownership responsibilities. And Lee, I know that you're working on some thinking around this that sort of gets into more of the nuance, I think, here. I think there's a lot more nuance around the idea of ownership than is commonly talked about.
I think I agree with your assessment, by the way, that people want ownership experiences. They don't necessarily want ownership responsibility. And I think the heart of the question is really that ownership is in reality a bundle of lots of different things. And we should unbundle the different elements of ownership and think about what users actually want. So ownership, when we talk about ownership and the ownership economy, and people talk about making their users owners through tokens, I think that's a proxy for a couple of different things. That's a proxy for governance responsibilities and participation in influencing the direction of the project. And then there's ownership in terms of economic rights or the potential for economic rights in the future. And I think users want the latter. And then maybe a small segment of users want the former, but it's definitely not everyone who wants to steward and participate and govern the thing that they're using. Whereas I think everyone cares about economic rights and economic benefits. I think this also goes back to Jesse's point about the obsession with sufficient decentralization and conflating decentralization with ownership. Yeah, I think what users actually want and what we should strive to give them is economic exposure. I think the governance piece of ownership is something that is not desired by most users out there. And perhaps I would even go so far as to say doesn't even serve the interests of the project potentially, because it is difficult to build something and iterate on something by committee.
Yeah, it's fascinating just sort of the bundle of assumptions that we're wrapping up in here. And it's a powerful soundbite. And also what I've seen, and I think have been partially responsible for, is seeing people sort of latch onto these big ideas before we really truly know what the impacts of building like that are. So I think this idea of decentralization, this idea of distributing ownership, there's such a powerful narrative there. And I think at the core, how you started off with the passion economy, the vision I have of the internet that we are still in is very much like the Middle Ages. In Europe, we are paying the right to farm fields and have the safety of our overlord and lack all property rights. And the impact that when we bring property rights into the broader society is massive it's why the middle class started to exist. And we've been living in an era of the internet where that middle class can't exist because we are contributing to the network or equity value of these big modern day feudal lords without having any property rights or ownership associated with it. And so that's, I think a very compelling argument, but how we go do that And I think ultimately, to me at least, the underpinning of that is that the more that every user can have economic exposure to the network value or the equity value they're creating, the more likely we're going to have a strong and vibrant middle class in society here. And I think so much of the social ills that we're having right now, driven in large part by the internet and who knows what AI is going to have, or can come back to this sort of lack of participation in the true value drivers of the modern economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to go back to your question about the ownership economy is this very compelling thesis, but why is it not all around us? Why is it the case that we're not actually owners of the products that we're using today, 3 years into this thesis? And I think what you just said is relevant to that discussion, which is that it's not just a technological thing that gets unlocked. It's also a social and cultural shift that needs to happen. And those changes happen on their own timescales and have their own sets of tipping points beyond the technology. Builders have to believe that this is the way to build networks that can be bigger and more successful than without user ownership. Users have to be desiring of ownership and understand the importance and the responsibilities that come with it. And I think we're still in the midst of that transition where, there are builders who are bought in to the idea of making users owners, but it's definitely not pervasive still. And I think the more success cases that we have, the more examples that we have of like the Blurs of the world that are able to outcompete incumbents because they made their users owners. I think in the Blur example, it would have been tremendously challenging for another centralized NFT marketplace to siphon that liquidity from the incumbent that had reached scale and 90+% market share in this alternate universe. Like, I think it's just hard for us to even imagine that happening. But for builders to realize en masse that user ownership is this new powerful tool in the toolkit, I think that is a cultural shift that is underway.
So you two are so you're plugged in and you are smart, inquisitive people. I'm sure you do this thing where you're checking your conviction quite regularly, right? Like you're exposed to the world, seeing examples out there. I think more examples are sort of the way that we build that conviction. So I'm curious, where's your bedrock conviction in the ownership economy being sort of the future of how we build valuable networks and applications?
I just think, I'm a very firm believer in, technology has things that it wants that are native to the technology itself. And I think what crypto wants is the ability to distribute value in the way that we distribute packets. That's like the new thing in abstract. So, the internet protocol, IP protocol, is a protocol for moving packets of information, right? And I think tokens are packets for value. This is like an analogy I often use. And so what's the implication? Well, packets enabled everyone on the internet to distribute information. Everyone became a publisher. Everyone became a creator. I think when you have packets for value, aka tokens, the result is everyone can be an investor. Everyone can own a piece of the internet. So bedrock conviction is that. I think that's what the technology wants. And then everything else is, things we need to figure out in order for the technology to sort of do its thing. And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean definitively we're going to get the outcome that we want in terms of how that value is distributed, right? But I look at the internet itself and how it democratized publishing and gave everyone the power to distribute information. And I think the potential is certainly there for everyone to similarly become an owner and democratize ownership in a similar way. And it's meritocratic, to be clear, right? The way your information gets consumed is meritocratic, and the way that ownership value gets distributed, I hope, will also be meritocratic. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what came before.
I'm curious your answer, Lee. Where's bedrock conviction for you?
I have really high conviction in the potential for this future. I think it's something that is imperative for us to steward the space towards and shape in the way that we want it to play out. I think it's not a matter of course that technology progresses in a certain way or is utilized towards certain aims. I think nascent technology can be guided towards a certain vision of the future or another. And the way that we view our roles in this space is not just as passive investors, but as active participants in the ecosystem who are working actively to make the ownership economy happen. And we do that by writing the content that we write, publishing these playbooks, hosting sessions with founders in the space. We're doing one next month for a bunch of consumer founders about token distribution strategy and token design. And so in terms of conviction, I think it's not a static level of conviction. It's like, I believe in this future. I very much want it to be the state of the world, but we have to do work to get it there. I would also say that there's precedence from the non-crypto world that ownership is this really powerful tool to help businesses be more successful and be larger than they would otherwise. There's this piece that I'm publishing soon, or I guess by the time this comes out, it will have been published, hopefully, knock on wood. And in it, I basically describe this one study that had taken place with a fintech application where users were actually granted a stock grant after they elected a certain brand, where they chose that brand and they said, like, if I shop here, I'm going to receive a stock grant. And they found that pre and post that stock grant, users' spend at those brands jumped 40%, extremely substantial. And so that element of feeling like an owner, feeling like you have control over the outcome of this company, creating that kind of buy-in through ownership is a really powerful tool. And I think that is the potential here.
To me, there's always this sort of debate around tokens, and I think people have strong opinions around tokens. And of course, I think a lot of that's driven by just the wild speculation and the mainstream media attention around it. But to me, the token is this sort of core enabler of this world that we're talking about here, right? Jesse, as you're describing, sort of this distribution of ownership. And I think like the exploration around the nuances of what a token should be, how it should be thought of, how it should be distributed is just still such a huge open design space. And I know a lot of the writing and publishing you've been doing on this is actually teasing at this. And Jesse, I think you wrote a post called Tokens Are Products. And I think it's a really interesting lens and very helpful lens for people who are building these networks or platforms that intend to distribute ownership to look at tokens through. I wonder if you can sort of dive into what the core thesis there is, or what the main takeaway should be.
Yeah. So the post kind of offers a framework for how to think about designing tokens and what tokens should be sort of optimizing for. And it leans on this more traditional sort of product design framework, which is known as like the jobs to be done framework, right? So the key idea there is like, when you're building a product, you should think about what job does this product do for the user? What problem does it solve? And I think it's helpful to think about the same question when designing a token. The reason I say tokens are products are, one, I think they fit this framework, but also like launching a token is kind of like launching a product. It requires engineering, it requires design, it requires marketing, all the things that go into launching a product, you kind of also need to do for launching a token. And so it sort of follows from that, like, okay, if it's similar, at least in terms of effort that you got to put into getting it done, we should also apply this classic product framework of like, what problem is this token solving for the user? And I was talking with someone the other day, and they're like, well, isn't the problem to solve like for the token to go up? Like, isn't that what that's the job everyone wants tokens to do, is like to go up? And I thought that was, they were obviously joking around. But I was like, actually, you're right. Like, I think for the vast majority of people out there, what they want in a token is economic alignment with the product or service that they're contributing to. They want to be able to participate in the upside. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable job to be done for a token, right? And we should just acknowledge that head on, right? For the vast majority of people, they're contributing something of value and they want to be able to participate in the upside of the value that they're creating. And tokens enable that. That's exciting, right? I think Bitcoin and Ethereum are case in point examples of that. Where, the early contributors, they believe before anyone else, they put in the work and they benefited from the growth in the network, right? And that's a job to be done. There are other jobs to be done, though, by tokens beyond economic participation. And this is where I think it can benefit founders to think through this framework and design their tokens for some of the other jobs, and maybe design the way their token actually works to solve these other jobs in very specific ways. So other jobs to be done. Well, some people that use your product, they may really care about control. They may be obsessed with your product and want to have, control over how upgrades happen and so on, right? Probably the vast majority of people don't care about that. And that's evidenced by, what we see in terms of, voting turnout in the crypto space and society at large. Most people don't care. But there's some subset of people who really care about control. And for them, that's a job that tokens can solve, right? And so, can you design your token ecosystem to do the job for those people especially well? And maybe that's not a job that like 80% of your users care about at all. And so you can also design your token to acknowledge that, right? That 80% of people don't care about this job and maybe they shouldn't even participate in it at all. So control is one of their jobs to be done. I think others are, and we were talking the other day about C Club, it's, C Club is a community, and like belonging to this community, being part of something at sort of a social level or community level is really valuable, right? And that's another job that tokens can kind of solve for, right? Is like you get access to community, you feel like you're part of something, you're a member. And so these are a couple examples of like jobs that tokens can do. And when you're designing a token, I think it's important to sort of isolate, acknowledge these different jobs, like take stock in who are the specific user groups that care about these respective jobs, and how do you design the token to sort of satisfy each of them respectively. And maybe, how do you bundle different jobs to be done together to satisfy more people, and so on, right? It's just a framework for thinking about designing a token.
Yeah, I think we're very enamored with consumer experiences, especially through the lens of communities or DAOs. And I think that's really the trend that I see happening here is, and you see it early on with what Friends with Benefits it's rolled out with their app experience, or Cabin is rolling out this sort of citizenship experience. And they're all going to feel very much like full featured individual product experiences that you participate in, you join. And I think a big part of what will result from that is the ability to provide the types of features that unlock the type of utility or experience people want from holding, owning, or earning a token in a much more clear or a way in where the narrative is not just yield farming or not just token distribution or not just purchasing from Uniswap. And so I think that's actually going to be a fairly big shift that I see happening right now. And I'm pretty excited to see what exceptional consumer product builders can do when they sort of bring the best of that Web 2 experience in with this superpowers that tokens can unlock. So I want to get to some news that you have. There's sort of exciting opportunities for folks to get more involved in sharing the brain space that we are sort of co-creating here today. But there's a really nerdy question that I have. I think, Lee, you were saying earlier, sometimes Jesse feels like he's 5 years ahead and we just need to get him to explain something. There's a tweet that you sent out yesterday that I sent to a few of our founders, and every single one of them came back and said, you're going to need to unpack this one for me. And so I thought, why would I unpack this tweet? Why would I not get the original human being who shared this tweet to unpack it? Because I shared the same intuition, but I'm very curious how you would explain it. The tweet is, next cycle narrative, every app is a roll-up with a token. The start is only months away, sort of referring to a much longer thread. Can you unpack that for our builders?
Sure. Okay, so to do that, I have to rewind the tape back to a post I wrote in 2018, actually, and it was about different eras of blockchain computing. And the analogy is Bitcoin is kind of the calculator era of blockchain computing. It's a blockchain computer that can do kind of one thing really well, which is digital gold. You can't really program it to do much else. It's kind of like a calculator. It just does math really well, but the early computer can't do very much more on it. Then computers evolved from calculators to the next era, which was the mainframe era of blockchain computing, right? And just like early mainframe computers, you had this one machine that was really clunky. You had to like rent time to use it. That's Ethereum, right? It's like Ethereum, slow, global computer, expensive. You got to share space on a block with everyone else. And, that's the PC or the mainframe computers were revolutionary. They changed the world. Right? And then they got exponentially more efficient, right, and more powerful. So same thing has been going on in blockchain computing since Ethereum's inception. And this blog post posited another era that would come after the mainframe era, which I call the server era. That was sort of a nod to what happened in the early days of the web, where every website had a bunch of like server racks in their closet, right, and these custom machines that they were building for their applications to keep their website online. And I think what I was alluding to there at the time was actually the sort of Cosmos vision of the world, where every application rolls their own blockchain. Rather, it's kind of their own infrastructure to service their application on top. And then I very vaguely, hand-wavy posited that there would be something that comes after that, which is the cloud era of blockchain computing. The idea that I had in mind there was, you sort of move from everyone running these janky servers in their closet to this really scalable, really performant cloud computing environment where anyone can just deploy their application and see it scale up without having to think too much about it, thanks to these great cloud computing data centers that we have, right? And the difference, of course, would be because this would be the blockchain era of cloud computing. It would be trustless and decentralized, just like Ethereum was at the outset. And what I'm sort of coming around to with this tweet is that the cloud era of blockchain computing is actually coming into focus. And it is going to be through this modular stack of, blockchain like Ethereum at the base and roll-ups on top, and then application-specific roll-ups potentially on top of that. And critically interoperability between all these rollups such that it feels like this scalable cloud. Like, you don't think about which AWS data center your application is really running on, whether it's in the West Coast or the East Coast. It's one just scalable computing fabric. That's sort of what I was getting at. And like, why now, I guess, is sort of part of your question. Like, why am I saying this is the next cycle narrative? I think it's because the tooling to enable applications to sort of deploy into this really scalable computing, blockchain computing fabric is starting to come online right now. Like, the rollups are getting mature enough. There's tooling that enables application developers who are not specialized in infrastructure to use, these new components in the stack. And I think the result is going to be that app devs can scale really easily, really, really quickly without having to think too much about the underlying infrastructure. And the result will be tokens for those applications that, don't have to think about the underlying blockchain itself as you do in the Cosmos sort of view of the world.
Yeah, to me, it changes the type of economic or business models that can be played with here. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think, we've seen platforms be able to turn to transaction fees as a way of actually monetizing the economic activity that are happening there. My intuition is something similar happens when you start to imagine what these sort of individual app chains can be for apps and maybe apps is the wrong look because it starts to feel like networks and ecosystems, and it looks a little bit different. But from gaming to social networks, it's I agree with your sort of, you squint and you can start to see it. And I mean, I was shocked as I started diving into just how accessible spinning up these things are like right now. Okay. You guys have something you're working on, something that's been announced recently, something that's, I think the application deadline is closing in on us pretty soon. I believe it's called the Variant Founder Network. I would love for you to let us in on the secret of
the Variant Founder Fellowship. Yes, we also announced the Variant Network recently.
Okay, see, not this. Okay, that's an honest mistake. The fellowship. Tell me about the fellowship.
Yes, so we just recently announced this piece of news. We're very excited about it. We're launching a fellowship for emerging founders in crypto. It's going to be a 3-month-long program that takes place over the summer for founders who are building in crypto, who are at the earliest stages of their journey. They might have an idea that they want to work on or an early prototype. In any case, they're pre-seed or earlier. And they are going to be invited to come in and engage in a lot of programming that we have that's taking place with our portfolio founders, with our network of strategic advisors, experts, as well as our internal investment team. So one of the things that we are engaging in and investing a lot of resources into this year is something that we call the Variant Network, which was also just recently announced, which is this peer learning network comprised of all of our founders and the senior execs at our portfolio companies. We're already doing a lot of programming there to help founders and builders learn from each other. They're participating in workshops with each other. As I said, like upcoming, we have this token workshop with a bunch of our portfolio founders. And this has been, in our experience, the most effective way to elucidate a lot of best practices in crypto, given that these folks are the people who are building on the cutting edge. And so the Founder Fellowship is going to build on top of the Variant Network. And these fellows are going to be invited to participate in all of the programming that we have going on for our portfolio companies. And then on top of that, there's going to be specialized curriculum that's built for founders at the earliest stages pertaining to topics like Web3 go-to-market, fundraising, regulatory, hiring, business models, etc. And then throughout the process, fellows are going to receive hands-on mentorship and be able to tap into the brain power of the Variant team, domain experts, as well as portfolio founders. So applications are currently live on our website, variant.fund. They're going to be live until April 17th. I encourage everyone to apply. The program is going to be entirely remote. It's going to happen online, but sessions are going to happen on US Eastern Time. And we're also notably offering this program for free. So we're not going to be taking a stake in the companies that go through the fellowship. There's no mandatory investment or anything like that, because we felt like this was really the approach that we wanted to take to be the most founder friendly. And our hope is that this fellowship catalyzes a lot of innovation in crypto. We obviously have a ton of conviction still in crypto, and the belief that it can catalyze this more meritocratic, user-owned internet is still something that we very much believe in. And we really hope that more founders build in this direction.
Awesome. I mean, you know that I am a big believer in the power of peer support, learning, the networks. It's the core of what we do at Seed Club. Magic happens when you bring people who have sort of shared general alignment and trying to build something that's hard. And being a founder generally is challenging. It's lonely. There are many things that you can't talk about with your team or with your family or with your spouse. Doing it in Web3, crypto, in this sort of, it adds a whole other new layer to it. So there is nothing that I would recommend more than people find their squad, find their people they can connect with, where not only are you going to get the benefit of sort of the faster learning loops. These learning loops, I mean, crypto is, I don't know how you would remotely stay up to date with what's happening in this space if you do not have your squad. And I'm sure the quality of human beings that are going to be applying for this are just going to be next level.
Also want to put in a plug that we're really looking for founders who are building across the full stack of crypto to participate. So it's not just dedicated to one particular domain or vertical within crypto. It's going to be applicable to builders across infrastructure, DeFi, and consumer applications. And already, like, the quality of applicants is amazing. People are building things like new network states and new Web3 social applications and all across the board. So anyways, get your application in before April 17th.
Amazing. Very excited about being able to bring you two together on a podcast. I know we've shared many enthralling conversations in the past. Really, my intention behind this podcast is to be able to make those conversations that often just happen one-to-one or, you know, privately, and be able to make them available to folks. I think this one has been super interesting. You know, Variant has a ton of amazing resources as I'm writing at variant.fund. So I encourage folks to go have a look there. It's definitely a resource that I pay close attention to. And just want to thank you both for spending an hour with us today, and look forward to continuing to build this user-owned internet together.
Thanks so much, Jess, for having us. This was really fun.
Yeah, +1. Thanks again.
Hello, friends. Steph here, Media Team Steward at Seed Club. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review Building at the Edges. This helps other Web3 builders discover these valuable insights. And tell us what you think on Twitter. Tag us at @SeedClubHQ. Thanks for listening. See you on the internet.